So the technique of self-parenting follows the general guidelines of awareness, acceptance and action, in that we first raise awareness in the client of the corporate self, supporting the client in becoming fascinated with changes in their tone, body language and physiology, along with shifts in grammar and the particular circumstances in which these things happen. Secondly, we must encourage the client to accept what they have become aware of. I say that there is no such thing as an unacceptable thought or feeling, and I have often had to sort of define acceptance because it has a terrible press these days. People tend to think that they've become some kind of doormat or something. I explain that acceptance of something does not mean agreement with it, nor does it mean approval of it. Nor is it an understanding of permanence. It's simply an understanding that something is real, something actually happened. Now you can study the AAA approach elsewhere on my site, so for now I'll go on with an assumption that you have an understanding of that. Following the assurance that acceptance does not mean they have a mental condition, just the human condition, I ask the client then to gather photos, remember a nickname, and an idea really of when the separate identity of the child first emerged. Now this can often be take time. You should take your time over this, but I suggest my clients keep the photograph by the bed, and a nickname is a really good idea. The idea here is that we first of all create a little bit of separation before we go for integration. They have to be able to talk about their child as a separate entity to some degree. So once we've got the voice of the child and we start to get an understanding of that, we can start to work with them on the circumstances in which these things happen. When working in a group, when a client is obviously speaking from their child voice, I will often say something like, to the group, I will say, if you'd only heard that voice on a tape recording, how old would you say that person was? Now, once established, I ask the client what their child needed, what they as a child needed at some difficult times from their parents, but did not get. Now, this forms the material for the self-parenting technique. It's the gap in the needs of the child that we're looking for. It can be a perceived gap or a real gap, it doesn't matter, because we're working with the perception of the client. So the client is encouraged to offer this as a form of self-parenting at the time of difficulty. So when they feel these things happening, when they feel the voice of the child emerging, that's when they offer the self-parenting, that thing that they didn't get at the time when they were that child. So the aim is integration of our separate parts into an established and corporate self. Remember that questions such as, what does your adult want to say to your child now, automatically place the client back in the adult place, since the other parts could never answer such a question. It's only an adult that can answer a self-reflective question such as, what does your adult think of this? Now, breakthrough comes when the voice of the adult is heard during episodes that historically only involved the voice of the child. When the self-parenting is effective, the effect is immediate. This is our best aid in this work, since there is simply no waiting for results. Often the voice of the child, for instance, is accompanied by a knot in the stomach, or people will report a tension in my back. This disappears immediately if the self-parenting is effective. Psychologically speaking, the child is the feeling. Now, just a note here to watch out for what I call imposters. These are occasions when, as counsellors and as therapists, we may assume that the child is running the show because of some painful or unwanted outcomes. But in actual fact, it's a decision made by the adult. Now, you can recognise this behaviour by being sensitive to adult sophistication, what's really the opposite of the child voice. Adult ideas are more morally based and they're more intellectual, sophisticated, they have a bigger picture in mind. What can make them harder to spot is that they can have what seems to the outsider to have no advantage or be very painful for the client. But when we acknowledge that these are an adult decision, it changes our attitude, as this behaviour is seen as self-determination, and therefore we must work with the client. And we must view it as a choice of the adult. Remember that this is not exactly the same perspective as trauma work. Inner child work, generally, we're not just looking for triggers. The call to action, as it's called, of the younger part may be quite gentle and long-lasting. In the examples that follow, Claire and Adam involve inner child work after the abstinence has been established for, in some cases, I think Claire for 2 years, and in Adam nearly the same, about a year. However, with Brian, he's still working with his inner child at a much higher risk factor. So I think these are good examples to see and to see the difference between them. So let's finish with a word about risk. Now, we learn through our difficulties, and yet addicts use their drugs and behaviours as protection from risk. Safety barriers against life and living connections. Of course, like any other inappropriate strategy, the cure often becomes worse than the disease. The addiction itself becomes the biggest risk. So how do these factors play a part in our practice? We must evaluate risk and work with it. If we stay with the client in their safest place, there'll be no growth and no recovery. Just a sustained and uncomfortable abstinence that often seems like a hair trigger waiting to go off. If you work long enough in recovery circles, you'll see this a lot. If we encourage the client, however, to act outside of their or society's safe boundaries, we'll become irresponsible as counsellors. So gauging and discussing risk is a big part of effective treatment. Talking with your client about what will the cost of doing something be, or what are the possible risks involved. This is a big part of the preparation to effective self-parenting. Ultimately, the client should decide, having discussed it with you, whether it's a change of profession or becoming more authentic in their relationships. You will not always get it right. Mistakes are allowable. Mistakes simply become another part of the growth cycle. You could use the recovery box for this. The idea, like any kind of growth, is to go for what we call a stretch goal. Think of a sports gym. This is a good analogy. We get fit by exercising to the point where it hurts a little bit, but not so much that it makes us give up. So now I want to offer a few case examples to demonstrate how I work and what I'm trying to achieve when introducing this idea to my clients. The first example is actually from general counselling, not from my work with addicts. However, this case has been chosen carefully as it helps to show that this theory and practice is widely acceptable in general counselling, and this is where I first learned it and first learned to practice it. The first case is a client I shall call Tim. He came in for counselling because of anxiety, and we discussed his situation, which is described as follows. He struggled with anxiety, particularly at work or in any formal situation. He worked in highway design and production and was very successful at it. He was often asked to speak at conferences, etc., but this is where the problem started. He said he was very good at what I do, very confident about my stuff, but when I'm asked to speak or present anything, I just go to pieces. The level of anxiety is through the roof. Sometimes I physically cannot speak. So here's the first clue. We're looking for anything that seems out of proportion. When you bring hopefully a reasonably neutral view to all this and you see that that's way too big a reaction. We all have a bit of anxiety around public speaking, but that's, he physically can't speak at these moments and he just falls to pieces, even though he's a real expert in what he does. So this is way off the charts, okay? So the therapeutic practice began when we start to raise Tim's awareness of the voice of the child. Now, this included taking the time to ask him to remember any time he was traumatized or troubled as a child and what he needed from his parents at that time but did not get. So it also involved digging out all photos of himself when he was a child and using his nickname at the time. Now, this serves, as I said, to separate the parts, although our aim ultimately is to integrate. So it's important to note here that we may never get a clear understanding of what happened to the child to the client as a child, nor do they have to have had what would be classified as a traumatic experience. We're looking for what was traumatic for them. This experience can be part of the implicit memory and so may not be available for recall. They may never remember what actually happened. Another important part of the work is to start at the end. Now, a lot of good counselling does this, but basically in this case, what we're doing is we're assuring the client that the difficulty that has been impossible for their child, in this case, public speaking, will not be hard for the adult. Now, that's starting at the end, and I do this every time. I always assure the client that however impossible it feels to, confront people or public speak or whatever it is that they do that is so difficult for them, that their adult can do this easily, that this is not difficult for their adult. As we progressed, I asked him what he thought would happen if he took his 7-year-old son with him to work and asked him to do his presentation for him. To 150 professionals, he said, well, he would just fall apart. And of course, he wouldn't be able to speak. Now, of course, we would not expect a 7-year-old to do this, but that is effectively what is happening when our child is triggered in this way. We moved on to self-parenting practice. This is where the client adds the parenting that was missing when they needed it most as a child. My experience has been that the self-parenting generally falls into 3 categories, which we might call firm, affirming, and loving. Firm would be something like, come on, that's enough of that, we're not going that way, let me do this. So, authoritative, a bit of a kick up the pants, a bit of a, disciplinarian stuff. Works for a lot of people. Affirming would be something like, oh, you're so great to help me, that's so kind of you, but I've got this, let me take over now. Whereas loving would be more like, it's okay, I love you, you're okay, you can go and play now, I'll take over. Whatever works, works. The aim in all 3 cases is the same, to produce security in the child. That's what we're doing as parents. So the important part for you as a counsellor is to take the time to support the client's exploration of what they really needed as a child. Ask them what they would have liked from their parents at these moments of anxiety and stress but did not get. So I asked him to speak to his child and give him what he needs. And this is experimental because, as I say, the effect is immediate. When we get it right, you know straight away. One of the most useful parts of this practice is just this. When they get it right, it goes away instantly, whatever difficulties they have. So after a few sessions of working with these ideas, Tim walked in one day and announced that I did it, he said. It wasn't hard. I spoke in front of 200 colleagues and it was easy. Now, this is typical. I know it sounds like it's a massive claim here, but I see this again and again. When they get it right, they get this incredible breakthrough. What clients are looking for mainly is, a slight improvement. They would go for that. They'd buy that. But it's often much more than that. This is typical, as I say, of what to expect. So remember that what is scary for our child part is often nothing to an adult. Now, in Tim's case, the issue was simplified as we were talking about the child rather than the baby. Notice there was no baby involvement here. This can indicate where the person has had a very good upbringing. There's no attachment issues, there's no separation issues. So we're dealing with the child. In other words, there's a lot of emotion and we can reason with the child. But remember a very important factor as we look at the next 2 clients, that your child was the first person who learned to manage your baby. And when there's any issues around attachment or separation, somewhere between in the first 2 years of life, then we're looking at a more complex case. So Claire is the first of our two addicted cases, and she was seen as part of a building recovery group. I always recommend having some form of one-to-one counselling available or onward referral as part of the group structure if possible, because it's often the best way of moving forwards. She presented, this is Claire now, as intelligent with more than a small interest in therapeutic technique and approach herself. Like a lot of addicts, she had learned to manage a lot of her difficulties using unhealthy strategies. She had been clean for a couple of years, but had symptoms of people-pleasing and froze at times of stress, and often cried herself to sleep after difficult encounters. I first supported Claire in establishing the age of the child, which was 12. This was a time when she had gone or been sent to boarding school, and she had to learn how to deal with her sense of rejection and exclusion. She did this through making a commitment to the rules and standards of the school, and effectively swapped results for feelings. Conformity for acceptance. These are typical strategies developed by an emerging adult in difficult circumstances. Now, again, look for the signs here. We're looking for any sort of traumatic moment, memory, and so that helps us get the age of the child, in this case around 12. Also look for something where feelings are strongly involved. In this case, the chopping off of feelings and the commitment towards following rules as a kind of a substitute. Now, the baby gets involved when the strategies of the child are overwhelmed by experience. I know these are complex things I'm talking about, but you can watch this again and again to pick up on the importance of what I'm saying. Like a tidal wave of pressure flowing over a dam of conscious strategy, the flight, fight or freeze takes over. This was happening quite regularly with Claire. Anytime anyone used her for menial tasks or favours or bullied her in any way. Now, just to explain, in the charity that I'm working for, the houses, you're put in there with 4 or 5 addicts, and you have to work with each other and live with each other while you get to develop your recovery. And so what was happening was people, Claire was training everyone in the house that she was the person to ask for favours, and people used to leave her washing and stuff like this. And then she would feel terrible because she would get bullied around it and so on. So Claire mainly got to her meaning from talking about her ex. She was separated and about to be divorced. But we quickly started to work in the now. Claire had trained her housemates, as I said, she was in recovered housing, that she was there to be used for housework, etc., repeating the pattern of boarding school, which was about following rules and if I can just be, sort of a good enough person, that type of stuff. She was typical of many addicts in that she had touched on the inner child work in treatment, but really had got nowhere with it. This is very typical. Now, she started to recognise the voice of the child in our work together and realised that she could validate her feelings from an adult perspective. The breakthrough came when a housemate left her to do some washing, and she did it well, but she was shouted at for not doing it his way, which was the wrong way, by the way. She was about to shift into familiar territory of freezing and fleeing when the voice of the adult validated her feelings and reminded her that she'd done nothing wrong. She confidently reminded him of this, and she reported that he stood there for quite a time stunned at her reaction, which was really a response to him. Now, this shock often happens when, as I say, we've trained someone who we are. As is typical in these cases, once the voice of the adult is accessed, the balanced and grounded behaviour comes naturally, and it's not difficult for the client. Now, this moment marked the start of her new, more conscious, recovered self. Brian also came into treatment through the specialised area of addiction and recovery treatment. Binging on alcohol, sometimes a month at a time. He was also assessed as low on addictive personality. Typically, this means that the client is self-medicating against some form of trauma or mental condition. And again, I'll put a link about how to assess in this way. Now, in Brian's case, his child had managed his baby by suppression, resulting in a stammer. And again, this is very typical. This had developed at the age of 12, where we placed his child, developing the typical photographs and nickname, etc. You're kind of used to this approach by now. You understand what we would do. There was an event that happened, I won't go into detail, but something happened when he was 12 that clearly placed his child at that age. Now, unlike Adam, Brian was able to begin relationships with women and only stammered around men. So this is a case where we need to start considering risk and the part it plays in recovery work. Unlike the other two cases, here there was much more risk involved, as Brian occasionally met a woman who got through his defences. Mostly he saw women as trophies and used them for sex or showed off about them to his work colleagues. Now, I think you can clearly start to recognise the child there, and the way the child engaged with women were he didn't care too much about them. Very casual sort of relationships. But when someone got through or got past his child construction of relationships, it's very much like a Russian doll, where now the child comes out and instead of just meeting his adult or the next level, his child, these women actually met his baby. And this is where all the problems started. So how did they do this, and why some and not others? This is very important because this has all to do with the child's call to action. If a woman performed helplessness or neediness, the child would not feel able to hold them at the level of mild abuse or manipulation. The child would get more involved emotionally. And again, this is a very typical thing. I don't want to go into too much detail, but you'll find often that where hopelessness and helplessness and neediness gets involved, it sets up a context where we can get apparently more involved with our partner because we're kind of coming alongside them. But again, this is not like the proper relationship of intimacy where we're coming in front of them and we're looking eye to eye. So it's a kind of a safe way into a deeper relationship, if you like, for the child. And again, it's very typical. So when they performed this neediness, they showed him the helplessness, they would cry a lot or something like this, then the child would get much closer to them, apparently. And when the danger then manifested and the risk manifested when they showed affection then to someone else. As soon as that happened, the baby then gets the call to action. And this is a huge problem because the baby was pure rage. And of course the baby doesn't understand, but equates love with ownership and total control. So we need to understand by looking at the difference between our child and our baby, and why I feel we need to include both as separate parts in this work. So think of the child as mainly emotional, or mainly emotionally driven and motivated, with a developing moral centre that can be reasoned with using emotional logic. The baby, however, is not emotional and cannot be reasoned with. Once these women were introduced to the baby, there was a part of Brian that owned them and expected complete obedience, which of course they did not give. Now, to explain this, I often teach my students to use their experience of seeing mothers in the store with a 2-year-old. The 2-year-old is screaming and kicking the floor because they cannot have a sweet or some other world crisis. And mum is not acting, though, as if there is any crisis. She's not attempting to explain to the baby, though. She's holding the baby with one arm and paying for the shopping with the other. This gives us a great picture of how we parent the baby. Very different to the child. We parent the child by self-parenting, offering the child what they did not get at the moment of need. But the baby must be held. You cannot explain to the baby, you cannot parent in a way of comforting and explaining. You've got to hold them, and you've got to really accept the tantrum without accepting the crisis. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you picture the mum paying for the shopping with one arm and holding the crisis baby with the other, it's not a crisis for her, it's a tantrum for the child. And when we parent the baby, we do it this way. Now, Brian had his breakthrough when a girlfriend who had got through to his baby by using these kind of approaches, and again, the woman wasn't doing this on purpose, it was just a way of engaging in the relationship. But she then rejected him. Now, the baby does not compute rejection, and absolute rage ensues. This usually meant a month of drunken resentment and rage for Brian, where he's got in trouble with the police, and you can imagine all kinds of things happening. But at this time, after a couple of cans and surrounded by a month's supply of alcohol, which is what he used to do, the voice of the adult came through. Now, interestingly, this was the authoritative voice, which, as I say, there's 3 different forms. In his case, it was authoritative, and it came through like this: we're not going to go this way this time. We're not doing this. Okay? Now, this was especially powerful for me as a practitioner because he was already under the influence of alcohol. A moment when most addicts will tell you a story that there is no chance of stopping once they start. So just think about that. He'd already had 3 or 4 cans when the voice came through, and he stopped and he threw it away, because the adult will find this easy. The child, certainly the baby, will not. From the adult's perspective, even though he'd had a few drinks, there was no future in spending a month going this way. He saw the sense of simply stopping. So again, this is a thing that's easy for the adult, impossible for the child. Now, a note of caution here. In cases where the baby is involved, we should always start our work with the child, effectively winning his or her confidence before trying to understand the way the child managed the baby. In both of the latter cases, we have to be prepared to do the therapeutic work after the client has achieved the foundation of stability and become clean, or we must refer them to a specialist. So I hope you've benefited from this brief look at how I work with the inner child. Please consider sharing this with someone who may also benefit. Thank you for watching.